Hello and welcome, as always, to the Jacob and John show, or the John and Jacob show. I don't think we've decided which one it is. I'm the CEO and co-founder of International Intrigue, a former diplomat in Beijing and Shanghai. Jacob Shapiro is with me. He's the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Jacob, where are you this week?
I'm in Fargo, North Dakota, John, and I can't tell you how nice it is to need a sweater to walk outside. I'm in heaven.
A bit different from just down the Mississippi in New Orleans, I imagine.
It sure is.
Okay, so we've got a jam-packed show again this week. We're going to talk about what the heck is going on inside the Ukrainian government with President Zelenskyy reshuffling his cabinet, his war cabinet, his chiefs, all of that. Some pretty interesting results out of Germany in the local or state level elections that we'll have a discussion about. We're going to get into it over what China's playing at with invading Japan's airspace, and then wrap up. I want to wrap up by just chatting a little bit about a couple of notable visits from heads of state to some interesting countries. And then we're going to play another game, a new game, What's This Word, where we make the other one look silly by making him have a hot take that probably won't stand the test of time. But let's dive right in, Jacob. Why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy made arguably the biggest shakeup of Kyiv's wartime government. He replaced the foreign affairs minister, which was the most prominent position that was changed, but also the strategic industries minister, the justice minister, the deputy prime minister overseeing occupied territories, and the head of the state property fund. The reshuffle comes about 30 months into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or the Russia-Ukraine war. And Ukraine is right now trying to solidify its grip on the Kursk region while trying to resist Russia's slow grinding offensive, continuing successfully, mostly in parts of eastern Ukraine. As we've talked about here in recent weeks, John, the conflict has become much more dynamic in recent weeks. And civilians are bearing the brunt of that. 3 children and a bunch of other people were injured in a Russian missile strike in Lviv recently. There's been a lot of fighting sort of back and forth. I'll also just note this is not the first time that Zelenskyy has shuffled things up after the failed counteroffensive. The original architect of Ukraine's defenses, Mr. Zaluzhny, was sent, I believe, to be the ambassador to Britain. I think I have that right.
Yep.
And was replaced by the guy who designed the offensive into Kursk. So it's not completely out of the ordinary, but it is a major shuffle. What do you make of it, John?
Yeah, it's hard to know what to make of it. I think it's a good example that you've used about the Ukrainian ambassador to London. The word on the street that I heard at the time was that he wasn't super popular in Washington. I'm sure that they didn't hate him, but I think that there was some sense that he wasn't being super effective in the halls of Congress. I wonder if that's part of what's going on here, is that just some of these folks have kind of outstayed their welcome with the crucial partners that Ukraine needs to continue this war. That is entire speculation. I have no idea. I know that Kuleba, who's the foreign minister, was relatively well regarded in Washington. He was a pretty good networker. He seemed to know his way around the city. But other than that, it's hard to know what this achieves. I always come back to first principles on this stuff, Jacob. Like, they've been in a war government, a war cabinet, for 2.5 years now. The level of stress and just the tiredness that must be in that government, I don't think you can underrate it. So this could be simply something as simple as, hey, the US is going through an election. This is as good a time as any to just kind of refresh the bench, because they're going to have to meet new folks in DC anyway after November. So maybe it's a chance it's as simple as that. I honestly don't know, because to me, it doesn't have an obvious reason on the battlefield. I mean, I think the Ukrainian invasion or incursion into Russia is still going on. I haven't seen a ton of reporting about where that's at. So there's no real screw up that requires you to call for the heads of the folks who are doing this. So I don't know. I don't have a great answer, but that's some speculation.
Yeah, we have to engage in the inference game, and we have to do a little bit of Kremlinology, or I guess we can call it Ukrainiology, because we're not going to get that on the surface. I take your point that this could just be a matter of exhaustion. The problem with that is that Zelenskyy himself has to be more exhausted than anyone else. And one of his problems, I think, Ukraine was supposed to have elections, I believe, this year, and they're not going to have elections in the context of a war, of course. But it makes it hard to say that Zelenskyy still has democratic legitimacy. Because he has not been reelected technically on schedule. We know why. I'm not trying to throw shade at him in that sense, but I do think that's a challenge for him going forward, how to maintain the legitimacy of his regime in a context where it's basically impossible, or where they have deemed it impossible to hold a vote. I'll also say that, behind the scenes of Ukraine, even as the West has been very supportive of Ukraine, has been the issue of corruption over and over and over again. And one of the things that Zelensky has had to do is convince the West that his government is different, that he is different, that the oligarchs in Ukraine, there are oligarchs in Ukraine just like in Russia, do not pull his strings. And they really might have at some point. I don't think it's possible that Zelensky becomes president without at least some oligarchic support in the background. So maybe he got, to your point, some requests to clean things out. It may also, just be that they needed fresh perspective. So it's hard to intuit exactly what's going on here. But in addition to maybe outside powers wanting that, in addition to the fresh blood scenario, I would point to, I have questions about how Ukraine is doing on corruption and how the West feels Ukraine is doing on corruption, and whether some of this is tied to that quest. But, we're doing dangerous things here. We're inferring from the limited amount of evidence that we have.
Dangerous things on YouTube. I think I would just re-up your comment about Zelensky and his role. I've been thinking about that for a while now. Not only is he unlikely to be performing at the top of his game, the democratic legitimacy is a big thing. And I don't know how they do hold elections while the war is going on, and the war may go on for a long time. And this will become a bigger and bigger issue, because while he has taken on this Churchillian element of like wartime leader, let's get through this, and then we can discuss all the democratic inconveniences later. He's not Winston Churchill. This isn't a world war. So I think he's going to face a problem probably, sooner rather than later, around how he maintains that legitimacy in the eyes of his own people and the West. Now, speaking of the West, let's move a little further west over to Germany, Eastern Germany, but further west than Ukraine. I think there's some interesting results out of the regional level elections in Germany over the weekend. So just to recap, the Alternative for Germany, or the AfD, won 31% of the vote in the state of Thuringia, which is, as I said, in the east of Germany. Think Dresden, that area of Germany. And it almost tied for first place in the nearby Saxony region of Germany. So really, really strong results for what is, I think, seen as a very, very far right party. Just as a little bit of an aside, Marine Le Pen, who fronts the Front National in France, won't work with the AfD and the leader of the AfD because they're too far right for her. So that gives you a little bit of context on this kind of party. Other German parties, after the results were announced, have pledged not to work with the AfD to form a government. And in Germany's system, they will need to find coalition partners if they want to take power. So it looks like they won't be able to actually take power despite their very strong showings. It's their best result since World War II. And I think generally the response to this has been one of fear and worry in the mainstream media across the world, because again, this is a party that is fairly far right. Their leader is very controversial. He said some pretty I would call personally outrageous things about, not educating disabled kids next to able-bodied kids, and these kinds of really, really, I think fascist kind of policies. Obviously, you don't have to look too far to kind of draw the analogy between Eastern Germany and their history. It's no surprise that was the area that was firebombed and most controversially attacked by the Allies in the late days of World War II. It is a thing that I think has burned under the ground in that part of Germany for a long, long time. And again, Germans, AfD's supporters kind of hang their hat on this idea that Germany shouldn't be apologizing for its past, that it needs to have more German pride, more German nationalism. So I guess that's the context. And, zooming out, Jacob, this is a story I think we've seen various iterations of before. We've seen Brexit in the UK, this idea that, we need to be proud of our country. We need to take back control from Europe, from the globalists and the cosmopolitans in Brussels. We've seen Geert Wilders in the Netherlands have a very anti-immigration, Dutch first kind of policy. And as I mentioned before, Marine Le Pen in France is on the ascendancy, arguably there. I think it's a story of globalization, a backlash to that kind of global economics, to leaving disaffected populations behind, and to poor politics. Let's not beat around the bush. It's a response to bad politicians. And in Germany's case, I think Olaf Scholz's fairly weak chancellorship in Berlin. Am I kind of drawing too much of a bow here to kind of expand it out to those other countries? Or what do you see here?
Well, you use the F word, fascist.
I
Yeah, I
did.
mean, every time the AFD comes up, it's like you can hear the Teutonic Knights marching through the forest, and the eternal return of the Nazis is coming, and the Panzer divisions are lighting up. I'm not 100% there. I think Germany has some very real problems, but I also think Germany has been perpetually underrated. Remember, this is the country that The Economist called the sick man of the euro right before the third German economic miracle, where the West integrated the East, a thing that nobody thought possible, and now Germany is the beating heart of the European Union economically. I mean, take exception to the notion that Germany doesn't have to apologize for its past. Of course, it has to apologize for its past. Basically, everybody needs to apologize for its past. I'm here in Fargo, North Dakota. I did some research on, how it came to be a settlement here of white people pushing out Native people. So, at a certain point, the idea that we don't all have things in our past that we should be honest about is patently ridiculous. But I think the thing to say about Germany is, besides the West East divides, is that Germany made a really bad bet on cheap Russian energy. That Germany is an export driven economy, and it bet, number one, that it was going to get cheap Russian energy in perpetuity, and number two, that it was going to be able to sell German products into the Russian market, which it arguably still is doing via Kyrgyzstan and all these other places, if you look at the trade data, and that they might even get laborers from Russia and other countries to the east to build the BMWs and the Volkswagens and things like that. In some ways, achieving what the Third Reich always wanted to do, which was get Slavic labor to build things for the benefit of the German people. All that said, the bet on Russian energy blew up in their face, and not and to make matters worse, China, which they were thinking was going to be a consumer market for many of the things they export, ended up being a massive competitor. So you just have some major economic headwinds facing Germany. And because the East is, on a GDP per capita level, poorer, it was part of the Soviet Union for a long time. So those inequalities have not been fixed. Like, that is the place where populist politics is going to rear its head first. That said, like, I don't see an eternal return of the Nazis. I see populist politics. I see a democracy functioning the same way that German politics has functioned for generations. None of the warning signs that happened in the lead up to, like, the rise of the Nazis are necessarily there. So, is it part of a broader shift towards populist or right wing or fascist policies in Europe? No. Does it underscore, though, that I think the German economy is in for a very, very rough 2, 3 years as they metabolize the mistaken bet on Russian energy and the mistaken bet on exporting to China? Yeah, things are going to get difficult from here. And it's why all the poll numbers show you that Scholz has no support. The sooner that his government falls and the sooner the CDU CSU comes back in there and is able to impose some harsh reforms, not unlike how Merkel did when she came to power the first time, the sooner I think we will see Germany go back to normal.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about China. I mean, this comes on the back of news this week that Volkswagen is considering closing one of their large auto plants in China to save billions because competition from China has undercut their market. A story as old as, well, maybe not time, but at least the last couple of years. And I think you're right to mention Russia and the energy exports to Russia. I don't think you can discount Russia's role in stoking this kind of politics in Germany either. The hand of the KGB, FSB is very clearly across Serbia, Hungary, and Eastern Germany. I agree with most of what you say, but I wonder. It's a theme that I kind of set you up with these. Like, is the take of the media about XYZ too overblown? And your response invariably is, yes, I don't see that yet. A question for you then is, when is it time to start worrying about the rise of these far right or left in some circumstances, but we're talking about the far right, these far right parties in a continent that has, but for the last 80 years, had a long history of going to war with each other? What are the signals that you would look at to be like, this is actually a problem and not just populism?
There are two things that I would look at there. The first is, are they actually taking power? The fact that Marie Le Pen has had to reform her entire image and says she won't talk to the AfD, that's telling you that she has to moderate herself to even be close to respectable. It's the same thing with all these parties. They are still fringe, they're still radical. The place that I think it's most important, though, is that it is preventing the European Union at a broader level from developing coherent bloc-wide policies, because you still do have this reflective Euroscepticism that is in the electorate. And so the things that leaders want to do, maybe to bring Brussels closer together, they can't because their populations are keeping them honest in that way. So I think that's the biggest thing here. It's not, I don't see, if they start taking the halls of power, if they start changing the laws such that other, opposition parties can't run against them fairly. This is where Hungary starts to actually look like the real problem child here, not East, some part of East
Hmm.
Germany, then we can maybe talk about that. But for me, this is actually a story about, is Europe going to come together at the EU level, and are these populist wings and franchises big enough, influential enough to stop that move? Because I don't see them at the cusp of the power table yet. That said, and this is the lesson of the Nazis, things change quickly, and often the center thinks that it has control when it doesn't have control, and suddenly a fairly small faction can find its way in there if there is popular discontent. So I'm not dismissing it. I just wouldn't invoke um, 1930s Germany here, because I mean that was a hyperinflation and you had war debts to France and they just lost World War. I mean, it was a much different scenario today. Like East Germany is positively wonderful by comparison. So
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's that old saying: if you go bankrupt first slowly, then all at once. And I think you're probably right. But where something to be vigilant about, but not be too hand wringy about.
yeah, or to create self-fulfilling prophecies about.
Well, also right.
Um,
Yeah.
let's move on here, because here's one where I actually think the media is not making a big enough deal about this, and I know that you and I had a little spicy overchange over Slack about this. Maybe we'll bring it here. A Chinese military surveillance plane breached Japanese airspace off of the country's southwestern coast last week in what Japan's defense ministry is described as the first known incursion by China's military into its territorial airspace. They've only been taking note since 1967, because obviously there have been previous, violations of space going back and forth, probably. Although maybe not airspace. I don't know. I'd have to go back and do that. Anyway, there's been a lot of airspace encroachment problems for Japan recently. In 2023, Japan's self-defense force had to scramble fighter jets to intercept planes on 669 occasions. That's 3 times the number of 2 decades ago. 479 of those were responses to Chinese aircraft. But most of the time, that is around disputed areas, not around what is by both sides considered Japanese territory. In the meantime, in the South China Sea, things continue to be relatively tense. I hate that word tense, but it's the best that I can do, because there's not active conflict, but there is still, ramming Chinese ships and Philippine ships, and both sides pointing fingers at each other, and huge battles for peopleless atolls that probably are more threatened by high tide than either the Philippines or the Chinese military. How do you make sense of all this, John?
Do you ever get the feeling that these statistics, the first incursion into our airspace since records began, it's a little bit like those folks who cherry pick sports stats. This quarterback has the highest completion rating on a Tuesday when he's playing a team wearing purple. It's like cherry picking stats to say what you want.
Well, John,
Airspace is
I know that you know that 78% of all statistics are made up, right?
made up. Exactly. I heard 80, but I'm sure you're right.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it is a big deal. That's the bottom line of it. Whether it's the first, whether you include the Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands as Japanese territory or not, whether it even matters if it's the first or fourth violation of airspace, however you define this, it's a big deal, because Japan is a country with a serious military. It's rearming, and China is starting to look like it's importing its policy of gradual escalation from places like Taiwan, like Philippines, to Japan. And that's a potential problem, not only because Japan has a mutual defense pact with the US, so does the Philippines, but just that we've seen this Chinese playbook before. Where you and I think, disagreed earlier on Slack was that the last couple of weeks you've said China looks like the responsible party in a couple of these South China Sea disputes, and I've kind of let it go through to the keeper, just because I think you can make an argument that China isn't always on the wrong side of every one of these battles that you hear reported from time to time. But if you take, I was in China as a diplomat when this stuff was starting to hit the front pages of news. It was, freedom of navigation operations from the Australian and the US Navy to make sure that all these shoals and the 9-dash line didn't become international law. This was 2012, 13, 14. If you draw a timeline out 10, 12 years, there is only one bad actor in this, and it is China claiming territory that is clearly under no interpretation of international law or regional law or anything, claiming territory that is not theirs, and then lying about their actions in the region in terms of installing military bases on places that they've said they wouldn't. And consistently doing it over a period of time. Now, if individual actions are maybe not as definitive. So, Philippines, I think, have been fairly provocative over the last 6 months. The trend line is very clear, and China does this in Taiwan. They escalate, create a conflict, back off. Escalate, create a conflict, back off. And each time it gets incrementally more. It's the frog in the boiling pot kind of scenario, such that people don't even remember what 2008 was like when China didn't claim all of the South China Sea. People now just kind of assume it's China's. And what is worrying, and I'll stop my little rant here, is that if they start to do this to Japan, people are aware of this playbook now. They're alive to it, and I don't think Japan will tolerate it quite as much as perhaps the Philippines or Indonesia or Vietnam and some of their other neighbors have.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. And first of all, one of the reasons I think this is so important is because this is China not being the responsible one. This is one where China is clearly in the wrong. Whereas I think you can make an argument on these recent spats in the South China Sea, whether the Philippines is pushing things or who's actually behind it. You also said, you're like, you let it into the keep. I'm sure every goalie that ever faced Messi was like, yeah, I let him get that one into the keep too. So I'm not going to accept that. And I didn't know this until recently, but the frog in the boiling pot metaphor, it's actually not true. Like the frog would actually just jump out. Well, that like really changed things for me in general. I feel a reflexive need also to push back on the notion that, that this is somehow novel with China. I mean, look at the U.S. history in the Philippines or the U.S. possession of Guam. It's not like China is the first country to run around here and take territory and claim it for itself. I don't think that the United States has a lot of high ground to stand on there. It's just the United States won World War II, and it was able to write the history books in such a way that that is what is accepted. So I do think that China is not exactly beyond the pale in terms of the broad swath of history. Now, with all of that whataboutism off the table, what is really important here is they violated Japanese airspace. There's no territorial dispute here. This was something really meaningful. And for me, it can only be a couple of reasons that they did this. Number one, they're testing Japan. They want to see how fast Japan can respond to an incursion, which is sort of the scariest version of this. And there's also a US base fairly close by, so maybe they wanted to test some reaction time there too. They might have also wanted to see, well, is this going to distract Japan from whatever it's doing in the South China Sea? So, I mean, there's a very disturbing sort of, is this part of testing military defenses for future conflict that is scary? I also, though, if you go to Japanese analysts, and I went and Google translated some of what the Japanese analysts were saying, they were sort of pointing out this didn't really make sense. And that it was just one plane, it had no backup, and it was a fairly small incursion. Maybe somebody was just asleep at the wheel. Maybe it was just a mistake, which is why Japan, they've made a diplomatic statement that said, we disapprove of this, but they have not really reacted in any meaningful way, and it hasn't gone much from that direction. So that's the charitable interpretation, that it was just that kind of mistake. Either way, for Japan, this is really tough because China's their biggest security challenge and also their biggest economic partner. If Japan loses access to the Chinese economy, that is devastating for the Japanese economy. It's why Shinzo Abe, even though he was, before he was assassinated, was really the leader of the remilitarization of Japan, was also chummy with Xi Jinping and also tried to make sure the Japanese economic relations with China were good, even as those military security relations were bad. So I'm with you here that this is one that makes me sit up in my chair and ask what exactly China is doing, because my heart wants to say it's a mistake, but I can't shake the notion that they are up in the ante, not just for showman's sake, but that they're taking notes for what might happen if things do get serious in the future.
Yeah, and look, I have to put my cards on the table and say that I am I come at China questions with a fairly preset level of bad faith assumption on the Chinese Communist Party's behalf. And that, as you well know, that can make you a bad analyst. It can also make you a really clear-eyed analyst if you're right, if you get my point. And having spent that time in China, this is straight out of Mao's playbook. It is straight out of the Communist Party playbook. Small incremental challenges to your opponents, whether your opponents are propaganda, like domestic political opponents, or foreign adversaries militarily. Small incremental challenges, watch the response, calibrate, and keep going. And the only way that you can respond to that, and this is again in the Mao Communist Party playbook, is to have an absolutely absurd overreaction response such that you've raised the cost of these small little incremental challenges to not being worth it at all. And I think China knows that Japan, the Philippines, the US, Indonesia, all the countries in the region are so scared of war, as we all are, as we all should be, that they aren't going to overreact to this one thing. So you have Japanese analysts go like, oh, maybe it was a mistake. They give China that ability to say, oh, it was a mistake. We're very sorry. Now, 6 months later, something else happens, and we forget about it. I mean, it is brinksmanship, and in some ways, Japan kind of needs to choose one moment to have an absolute political meltdown about this, and show China the next time this happens, we're going to shoot it down. Problem is, you're much closer to World War III with that. So I don't know. I agree with you. This is a big deal, and I worry a lot about this stuff because I know China won't stop, and at some point, someone's going to have to call their bluff on it, and you just hope that will be a peaceful calling of the bluff.
Amen.
Well, on that terrible note, let's just finish with a couple of notable visits. I included this in our running order just because I think it's interesting. We're coming up on the summit season, as it's, I don't like that term, but we're coming up on. We've got UN General Assembly this month, obviously in New York, where all leaders descend on New York to make pompous statements, and it doesn't achieve much of anything. But more probably meaningfully, we've got APEC in Peru on the 10th of November, and the G20 will be in Brazil this year, the week after. So it's, world leaders are starting to see a lot of each other at this point in the year. But we've got Vladimir Putin, who just went to Mongolia. There was this kind of ridiculous question about whether Mongolia should arrest him because it's an ICC arrest warrant out. The idea that Putin wouldn't have stitched that up before he went to Mongolia is a bit absurd. But I think it was an interesting trip. Mongolia is not a big player at all, other than the fact of its geography sitting between Russia and China, and that there's some element of energy, coal and minerals coming out of Mongolia into Russia. So I don't think this is anything more than him just shoring up a relationship with a geographically sandwiched country and a regional, I can't even call Mongolia a power, but a regional country. We have the Pope in Indonesia. Again, not super relevant to anything in particular, but just interesting that he's off to the world's largest Muslim country, I thought. 250 million folks, majority Muslim. The Pope was there to have an interreligious dialogue. He's off to Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and Singapore as well. I can't remember the last time the Pope was in that part of the world, so I think it was notable. And then lastly, and this is the one I'm going to let you cook on, because you alluded to it last week, which is Egyptian president, dictator, whatever you want to call him, President Sisi was in Turkey. He visited Erdogan, discussed the Gaza war, ways to repair the long frozen ties between the regional powers, because Turkey and Egypt famously haven't always gotten along. It's the first Egyptian presidential visit to Turkey in 12 years. And it was, I think it was Sisi at that time in 2013 was actually the head of Egypt's army, because of course the Muslim Brotherhood's Mohammed Morsi was in charge at that time, and he was much closer to the Turks. So I don't know, there's a bit to unpack there. Take it where you will. Is any of this interesting to you, or am I just kind of, playing travel agent?
Well, I'm a nerd, John, so you know that all of this is interesting to me. The question is whether anybody is still awake by the time we're at the end of this, but I think that they are. I mean, you allow me to dunk on the ICC for a second, which, the ICC doesn't actually have any muscle behind it. The United States, I think, even though it was part of the negotiations to get there, I think it was the Bush administration that refused to sign the Rome Statute or pulled out on it. And the only people that have ever been arrested by the ICC are African dictators, because they don't have the ability to resist the ICC. I can't remember if Milosevic was I think he wasn't. I think he was European.
He was a special tribunal, I think, for Yugoslavian stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So that doesn't really count. So the ICC, it's a nice idea, but it doesn't really have any force behind it. And on my own podcast this week, I actually had a guest on who was talking about the WHO and about the World Health Organization and future pandemic declarations and how that all happens. And it was a similar sort of thing. Okay, great, there is this entity, but who actually arrests who? Who imposes things on who? It's just not going to work. So I think it's an opportunity to say that. I don't think that this Jew has anything to add to Pope Francis's visits. I don't really track them that much, but I think that the Turkey-Egypt visit is very important. I think it comes at a time that Egypt is really struggling. I mean, ships are not going through the Suez, so they are not getting all of that sweet Suez money. And if Egypt is going to turn its fate around, it has to find new ways to create economic value inside the country. And the one thing that Egypt has is a lot of really hungry young people, and especially young men. And if Egypt can become the type of place that Turkey gets to outsource some of its manufacturing to, and there's like handshake agreements there, if it's also that if Turkey can get Egypt a little bit out of the US orbit, if it can sort of have some influence about what's going on with the Suez, if it's resisting Iran and some of these other countries, I mean, it's a very, very interesting pairing, and it should scare the absolute crap out of Israel. I've said for a while now that Turkey is the thing that Israel should be worrying about. And if Turkey is currying favor with Egypt, I mean, now we're talking about existential levels of risk to Israel going forward. So I think that's a really, really important one to watch going forward. That said, ideologically, Erdogan has been very flexible. This is not a match made in heaven. The AKP is not quite Muslim Brotherhood, but it leans much more towards Muslim Brotherhood than it does to military dictatorship, which is what Sisi leans to, and that was the cause of the break. So maybe Egypt's getting the better end of the bargain here. I don't know, but that certainly is an interesting one. Is going to affect that relationship is going to affect the future of the Middle East in a huge way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the only thing I'd add to that is your point at the end there, where we have seen over history many, many times where leaders get together and try to forge relationships based on economic interest. And they sit down and they say, look at all our shared interests. But at the end of the day, cultural, religious, and, cultural religious differences tend to win at the end of the day. And the question isn't whether they'll become best friends. It's more how long can they maintain not hating each other. And if they are able to do that, then I agree. It's bad news for Israel, and they should be very worried about it. Go ahead.
Well, just before we leave this, I just want to say, because we were talking about the media earlier, I will say, I mean, all of these summits and conferences, when they come up usually in September, it's the silly season, because for journalists, and I'm not throwing shade at journalists here, I know how hard a job it is, and I rely on them a lot in my own work, but it's really easy to file a story about what a leader said or what meeting happened on the sidelines of this, that, or the other meeting. And I find that the quality of open source information declines dramatically in the month of September, because all of the stories are these easy to file stories about a meeting was had here and someone said this and somebody had this. And a lot of times we lose the plot of the real things that are actually happening in the real economy. So in some ways, this is my hardest month of the year to work, because I actually have to go out and figure stuff out myself, because those journalists aren't doing, they're enjoying all those meetings that you talked about.
In New York or Rio. Yeah. Okay. Let's finish up with a little game, as has become tradition. We're stealing them, as we always do, also a tradition, stealing them directly from, pardon the interruption, our favorite sports show. This week, we're going to do What's the Word? And the premise of this, Jacob, is that I am going to give you a short sentence, and you're going to describe it or fill in the blank with one word, and then tell me why you chose that word. And then you're going to do the same for me. And speaking of Israel, I know how much you dislike talking about Israeli politics, but you do know a lot about it, and I only get one chance a week to pick your brain on it. So what's the word on Biden's policy towards Israel has been?
Well, John, if you know me, you also know that I'll never use a 25-cent word when I have a $2 word at my disposal. The word here is anachronistic. Joe Biden's Israel policy, foreign policy, would have made a lot of sense in, say, the 1970s. It might have even made some sense in the 1990s. It does not make sense in the current geopolitical climate, for the simple fact of the matter that the United States is not dependent on imports of Middle Eastern oil or natural gas, LNG, anymore. And as long as that is the case, it is not sort of the level of issue that it was in those other times when the United States needed Israel for lots of different foreign policy reasons. But Biden is treating it like the United States still does need Israel for those reasons. So your $2 word is anachronistic.
Excellent.
Yeah, I know. I set the bar high for you here, but
we'll put a definition in the show notes for normal folks like me.
Oh, nonsense. They can go look up a dictionary and add a word to their vocabulary. John, I'd like to know, China's foreign policy in the South China Sea is blank.
Well, I think I probably tipped my hand on this one. I'll resort to emotional language and say it's outrageous. If I was analytical, I would say entirely it's expected. But yeah, as I kind of said earlier, I just think this is, if you take for granted that World War II was won and the American century happened, and yes, the international rules order does absolutely favor the West who created it. And I understand that fundamental problem that China has with the global world order, in the sense that it didn't have a hand in shaping it, and it doesn't feel like it has enough of a say in where it goes from here. That's a different question. given that it exists in this world order and has benefited, let's not forget, exceptionally from taking advantage of those rules-based orders, it has completely and utterly disregarded anything to do with it, and is really just exercising power politics in the region. It has taken outlandish amounts of, I would argue, what is the world's most important big waterway. Maybe not like, it's not the Suez Canal or the Malacca Straits, but as an ocean, it's probably the world's most important waterway, and it claims it for itself, and that is outrageous. I think 14, off the top of my head, 14 countries share a maritime border or claim some part of the South China Sea. China would have it that no one else has it. And as I said, this policy of incrementally deceiving, lying, challenging, being a bad neighbor, it is outrageous. And I think actually what needs to happen is a far more broad multilateral conversation around how China is basically kept in a box in the South China Sea. Not how we work with China, not how we kind of, are mealy mouthed in our statements about it, but how we deter China, just like conversations are happening inside the US government about how you deter China from militarily taking back Taiwan. I think the same thing needs to happen. As I said before, the stakes are very high though, because that's the kind of thing that leads to wars.
No, and we don't have time to do the topic justice, but I just want to say that is such a delicate thing to balance. You want to deter China without giving China the reason not to trust you in the first place. And for all the propaganda value of the century of humiliation, I mean, it is true. Like if we were describing British policy and Western policy towards China in the 1850s, I think we would also use the word outrageous. So
yes, absolutely.
I'm not insensitive to sort of the half-truths and all of those propaganda things, but the ability to deter while also having trust, like, I don't know, that we can't do basic things in foreign policy. We're going to pull that off. I hope so, but that seems almost impossible.
Absolutely. And on that note, let's leave it there for this week, Jacob. I know you've got to get back to conferences in Fargo, North Dakota. So thank you so much for your time.
Cheers. See you next week.